Thank you, Alpha Phi Alpha, Alpha Beta Lambda chapter, for this privilege to speak in remembrance of your great brother, who was also an esteemed member of Sigma Pi Phi, which happens to be my fraternity. My task is to speak to the right now relevance of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the great civil rights advocate. And that cannot be done without recognizing that the time since the last King holiday has been a year that has been like no other. We have wrestled in unprecedented ways with the life and death matters of racial injustice and COVID-19. And if that was not enough, we have learned from the election that many will no longer accept the will of the people in the proverbial competition of ideas that defines democracy. And so still today, we stand at a crossroads whereby we will stand up to ignorance, hatred, racism, and autocracy, or we won't. And after 245 years, that will be that, and America as we know it will simply be no more. So given the severity of the situation, I think the question for today, perhaps more urgently than ever before, becomes, does Dr. King's legacy live in you? And I say that because one of the reasons that we are where we are today is because too many will lock arms in saying we shall overcome someday, one day out of the year, but the rest of the time, some of us at best don't stand for anything that Martin Luther King Jr. stood for. And at worst, in reality, some of you who celebrate King with us in his death are actually working against the equity, the freedom, and the justice that he died fighting for. So please ask yourself today, does Dr. King's legacy as a civil rights advocate really live in you? Because if it does, then something on the inside will not allow you to proclaim that you are pro-life, and yet you refuse to wear a mask in public in the middle of a deadly pandemic. If his legacy lives in you, then it bothers you that some big corporations are getting richer from government relief and welfare, while children are going hungry, and anything that benefits struggling people is being branded as an unaffordable handout. Does Dr. King's legacy live in you? Because if it does, then you will stand against health and housing, education and employment, and criminal justice disparities, always understanding that all of these stem from economic injustice. Does Dr. King's legacy live in you? Because if it does, then you cannot dismissively respond to the cry of Black Lives Matter that's born out of generations of pain and deadly oppression, as if all lives or white lives face the same kind of government-sanctioned hazards and threats as Black lives do. If his legacy lives in you, then you can no longer tolerate the use of no-knock warrants, like the one that caused Breonna Taylor to be killed in her own home by the police in the middle of the night. Does Dr. King's legacy live inside of you? Then there has to be a reaction to his words, that there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor political nor popular, but you must take it because your conscience tells you that it is right. And the time is always ripe to do what is right, because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. May God continue to increase and further the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. through the works of our hands and the resulting transformation of many hearts.